The 1790s marked one of the most volatile decades in European history. The French Revolution, which began in 1789 with cries of liberté, égalité, fraternité, had descended into bloodshed, chaos, and global alarm. Monarchies across Europe trembled as the guillotine silenced nobles in Paris, and revolutionary fervor crossed borders with fire and steel. Britain, the dominant maritime empire and guardian of the old order, knew that the war against France was not just political, it was existential. Trade routes, colonies, the balance of global power, all were at stake. Britain joined the First Coalition, a European alliance formed to crush the revolution before its ideals took hold across the continent. But by the mid-1790s, France had not only survived, it had emerged stronger. Its armies seasoned, its generals ambitious, and its navy rebuilding. One by one, coalition partners fell away or made peace with France. By 1796, Britain stood virtually alone in the war. Then came a devastating blow. Spain, whose navy had once fought beside Britain, signed the Second Treaty of San Ildefonso and became France's ally. Now Britain faced a terrifying possibility: two great naval powers, France and Spain, combining their fleets. This would give them overwhelming superiority in European waters, threatening British sea trade, colonies in the Caribbean and India, and even the British Isles themselves. More urgently, the fortress of Gibraltar, a linchpin in controlling Mediterranean access, lay exposed. Spanish and French ships could choke off supplies and force Britain to retreat from the region. To prevent that, the Royal Navy would have to take the fight to the enemy before the fleets could unite. This was more than a battle for territory. It was a battle for survival. The fate of the empire now rested on the leadership of men like Admiral Sir John Jervis and a bold young captain rising through the ranks, Horatio Nelson. In the cold dawn of early 1797, the Royal Navy stood between Britain and disaster. Admiral Sir John Jervis had been entrusted with this task, not because he was the most flamboyant commander, but because he was precise, relentless, and ruthless in enforcing discipline. He had reshaped the Mediterranean fleet into a hardened, fighting force, smaller than its Spanish rival but far more cohesive. Every gun crew was drilled to perfection. Every officer understood the stakes. Morale was high, not because of overwhelming strength, but because of clarity. Every man knew that losing meant surrendering the seas to the enemy. Jervis had just 15 ships of the line. The Spanish Armada, led by Admiral Don José de Córdoba, boasted 27, many of them massive first-rate warships with over 100 guns each. Yet Jervis was determined to confront them head-on before they could link with French reinforcements near Cadiz. He calculated that aggressive action, even against superior numbers, might yield victory if the Spanish fleet could be caught disorganized and forced into close combat, where British seamanship and gunnery could shine. Among Jervis's captains was a man whose reputation preceded him, Captain Horatio Nelson. Brilliant, daring, and insubordinate when he believed the moment demanded it, Nelson had earned respect for acts of reckless courage that somehow always turned out victorious. Commanding the 74-gun HMS Captain, Nelson was a wild card, but one Jervis was willing to play. In early February, news came that the Spanish fleet had slipped out of Cartagena and was heading for Cadiz. Jervis immediately ordered his fleet to intercept them near Cape St. Vincent, a rugged point on Portugal's southern coast. On the morning of February 14th, amidst thick fog and heavy swell, British lookouts spotted the massive Spanish formation stretched thin and disorganized. It was the chance Jervis had been waiting for. Orders were issued with military precision. The British fleet swung into action like a blade unsheathed. Sails snapped in the wind. Signal flags rose up the masts. The chase began. Ahead lay the thundering cannons of 27 warships. Behind surged a smaller, leaner force, driven by discipline, courage, and destiny. What followed would go down not only as a brilliant victory, but as the moment that launched Horatio Nelson into naval legend. The dawn of February 14, 1797, broke over the Atlantic with a cold, damp fog blanketing the sea. Off the coast of Portugal near Cape St. Vincent, The British fleet under Admiral Sir John Jervis stood ready, slicing through the gray waters like a blade hunting its mark. The British ships were eerily silent except for the sounds of flapping sails and creaking wood, each man on board tense, eyes straining through the haze. Visibility was poor, but not for long. From the crow's nests of HMS Captain and other British ships, distant shapes began to emerge like phantoms in the mist. Sails, masts, dozens of them. It was the Spanish fleet. Admiral Don José de Córdoba's 27 ships of the line, along with several frigates, were sailing in a loose, scattered formation, having been caught off guard by poor coordination and fog. Their line was unformed, vulnerable. They had not expected the British to appear so swiftly or so ready for battle. Jervis seized the opportunity with steely calm. With only 15 ships of the line, he could not afford to engage in a prolonged exchange of broadsides. Instead, he gave orders for his ships to sail directly between the divided sections of the Spanish fleet, separating them and throwing the enemy into disarray. The British line cut the Spanish formation in two, sowing confusion. British gunners fired with cold precision, hammering the exposed Spanish ships before they could organize. Meanwhile, on HMS Captain, Horatio Nelson scanned the chaotic horizon and saw something Jervis could not from his position further back in the line. 5 massive Spanish ships, including the colossal San Jose and San Nicolas, were preparing to break away and regroup. If they escaped, they could form a new center and prolong the battle, or worse, turn the tide. Nelson made his decision in an instant. He turned HMS Captain out of the line, disobeying Jervis's standing order to maintain formation. It was an act of insubordination, one that could have ended his career. But Nelson knew this was a moment for daring. Nelson's maneuver was bold to the point of madness. Breaking formation in the middle of battle was unheard of in the Royal Navy. Discipline and cohesion were sacred. Yet Nelson had always believed that in war, initiative often trumped doctrine. He had seen that the most dangerous segment of the Spanish fleet, 5 ships including 2 of the most powerful first rates, was maneuvering to escape and potentially rejoin the rear of Córdoba's forces. Nelson knew if they succeeded, the battle could swing against the British. He turned HMS Captain sharply toward the Spanish group, directly engaging the 112-gun San Nicolas and the even larger San Jose. HMS Captain had already taken heavy fire and was badly damaged, her sails torn and guns overheating. Still, Nelson pressed on. His ship collided with San Nicolas, and without hesitation, he ordered a boarding party. In an extraordinary moment of raw naval warfare, British sailors swarmed the Spanish deck with cutlasses, pikes, and pistols in hand. Brutal hand-to-hand combat followed as cannon smoke drifted across the bloodied decks. Then came one of the most legendary moves in naval history. Seeing the nearby San Jose still firing, Nelson did something no naval commander had done before. He led his men from the deck of San Nicolas straight onto San Jose, using the captured ship as a bridge. This double boarding was later immortalized as Nelson's patent bridge for boarding first rates. Within minutes, both Spanish giants surrendered. By this time, the rest of the British fleet had followed Nelson's lead, attacking with renewed ferocity. Inspired by his audacity, the Royal Navy turned what had seemed a dangerous gamble into a masterstroke. 4 Spanish ships of the line were captured, including the 2 Nelson had boarded, and the rest limped toward Cadiz in defeat. Jervis, far from punishing Nelson for disobedience, recognized the brilliance of his decision. Nelson's insubordination had changed the course of the battle. Instead of court-martial, he received glory, fame, and promotion. The Royal Navy had just won one of its most lopsided and daring victories, and Nelson, through courage and instinct, had become its rising star. As the smoke cleared and the cannon fire faded into the winds off Cape St. Vincent, it became apparent that something extraordinary had occurred. Against staggering numerical odds, the British fleet had shattered the cohesion and confidence of one of the largest navies in the world. 4 Spanish ships of the line had been captured, including 2 massive first rates, San Nicolas and San Jose, seized through one of the boldest boarding actions in Royal Navy history. The Spanish fleet, battered and demoralized, fled toward the safety of Cadiz, leaving behind wounded men, shattered decks, and broken mastheads floating on the sea. Casualties were telling. The British, despite their smaller numbers, had sustained fewer than 300 killed and wounded. In contrast, the Spanish losses exceeded 1,000. It wasn't just a tactical victory. It was a psychological one. The myth of Spanish naval superiority had been broken. The discipline, fire control, and courage of the British crews had proven decisive. And above all, Nelson's audacious break from the line had transformed a risky engagement into a legend. The victory was not without political ripples. In London, the news arrived like a lightning bolt. Admiral Jervis was celebrated, awarded the title Earl of St. Vincent, and heralded in Parliament as the savior of British control over the seas. But it was Horatio Nelson who captured the public's imagination. His name raced across newspapers, and his double boarding was recounted in taverns and salons with breathless admiration. Though technically insubordinate, his success was undeniable. Rather than censure, he was promoted to Rear Admiral of the Blue and knighted, his daring forever engraved in the British national memory. The Battle of Cape St. Vincent did more than shift naval balance. It resurrected morale in a nation weary of war. It signaled that even in isolation, Britain could stand firm against continental giants. More importantly, it hinted at a new kind of warfare, led by individuals willing to risk everything in moments of peril to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. Cape St. Vincent became more than a battle. It became a blueprint. For the Royal Navy, it validated a doctrine based not only on firepower and numbers, but on aggressive initiative, rapid maneuvering, and unshakable discipline. For Horatio Nelson, it was the first great leap in a meteoric rise that would later include the Nile, Copenhagen, and ultimately Trafalgar. The lessons he learned at St. Vincent, boldness in the face of danger, the power of personal leadership, and the effectiveness of close-quarters assault, became the cornerstones of his naval philosophy. For Spain, the battle was a bitter wound. The Spanish Navy, once a cornerstone of European naval dominance, found itself discredited and demoralized. While Cadiz remained in Spanish hands, it became more of a prison than a fortress, with British ships blockading its harbor in the months to follow. The Spanish alliance with France proved unable to recover this blow, and internal unrest soon plagued the Spanish monarchy. The broader geopolitical impact was even more significant. Britain's ability to strike such a decisive blow while outnumbered gave pause to any enemy that underestimated the Royal Navy. It restored faith among Britain's colonies and trading partners, reinforcing the notion that the seas still belonged to the Union Jack. But above all, Cape St. Vincent launched a legend. Nelson, who had once been merely a promising officer with a reputation for recklessness, had now become a national symbol of courage, brilliance, and sacrifice. He showed the world that individual valor, when paired with strategic foresight, could change the course of history. The echoes of Cape St. Vincent would resonate not just in the Admiralty charts, but in the hearts of a nation preparing for the wars yet to come. To truly appreciate the ferocity, brilliance, and sheer audacity of the Battle of Cape St. Vincent, modern audiences must see it, not just read about it, but witness it in motion, space, and scale. Through the lens of immersive 3D visualization, this battle transforms from a footnote in naval history into a visceral, high-stakes drama unfolding across the fog-choked waters of the Atlantic. The 3D experience begins in the eerie quiet of the early morning sea. Rolling fog creeps over the dark ocean as outlines of masts and rigging begin to take shape. Massive Spanish ships of the line, moving sluggishly in a scattered formation. The viewer is placed high in the rigging of HMS Captain, the wind moaning around the ropes, the distant thunder of surf crashing against Cape St. Vincent's cliffs. Slowly, the camera pans across the decks, showing British sailors gripping cutlasses, gunpowder-stained hands readying the cannon, faces tight with focus. Suddenly, the battle explodes into motion. Through dynamic camera sweeps and spatial tracking, audiences can follow Jervis's brilliant maneuver, his fleet cutting through the Spanish line like a sword. Cannon smoke fills the air as each broadside erupts in fiery blasts. The soundscape roars with thundering guns, splintering wood, and shouted commands. Spanish ships scramble to reorganize, while British frigates press forward, each shot timed and devastating. Then comes the heart of the visual sequence, Nelson's break from the line. In cinematic slow motion, HMS Captain, already scarred from previous engagements, turns against the tide and barrels toward 5 colossal Spanish ships. The sea heaves beneath her as her crew braces. Grappling hooks are hurled. Cannons roar again at point-blank range. The viewer is pulled into the chaos of boarding San Nicolas. British sailors storming the deck, clashing swords in hand-to-hand. Combat, musket flashes lighting up terrified faces. But the most iconic 3D moment arrives as Nelson, undaunted and bloodied, orders his men to cross from the deck of one enemy ship to the next. The viewer follows this daring leap, from the splintered rail of San Nicolas to the towering deck of San Jose, as smoke, fire, and screams surround the impossible act. It is history made real, not in text, but in action, motion, and breath. Overlaying these scenes are animated tactical maps, showing fleet movements, shifting formations, and wind direction in real time. Strategic decisions unfold on screen, with Jervis's and Nelson's choices highlighted as bold moves against chaos. Every visual beat is anchored in historical fact, down to the colors of naval flags, the positions of gun decks, and the swell of the February Atlantic. The 3D reenactment ends with a sweeping view of the battered Spanish fleet retreating toward Cadiz, smoke rising behind them, and the British fleet, smaller but unbroken, holding the sea. Above it all, the Union Jack flies from the mast of HMS Victory, signaling not just triumph, but transformation. In this final immersive retelling, the Battle of Cape St. Vincent becomes more than a historical record. It becomes a cinematic resurrection, a living moment of defiance, strategy, and courage that helped shape the destiny of empires. And at its center stands the figure of Horatio Nelson, forever etched into history, not as a myth, but as a man who risked everything in the fog of war and rewrote the rules of battle.